Dear ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Today I would like to tell you about the illegal war Vladimir Putin is waging against Ukraine, against our country, against our people. Actually, 4 years of this illegal war of Russian aggression. Both, it includes the occupation of Crimea and the invasion of Donbass, eastern Ukraine. Today I want to focus on how Russia killed not only innocent Ukrainians, but 298 innocent people, including 80 children, in Malaysian jetliner MH17. It happened 17th July 2014 in Ukrainian airborne. And Ukraine, actually first time ever seen by our eyes at our soil, in our airborne, such a notorious terrorist act where so many people died. And the Buk missile system brought from Russia illegally to Ukraine, to the territory under the control of Russian troops, occupied by Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, was used against innocent people. On Thursday, July 17, 2014, I immediately received all the information, specifics regarding the plane, the air corridor it was using, and location of the crash. We quickly tapped the conversations of those terrorists. That night, I received also the information about the futile attempts from the very beginning of Russian general staff to disguise their crime. It took us less than 24 hours to solve the crime. Committed, again, let me reiterate, committed by Russian military on duty, by Russian perpetrators downed the Malaysian airline jetliner MH17 over the territory of Donetsk Oblast, Donetsk region, Ukraine. Controlled, again, I'd like to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, controlled by Russian troops and Russian-backed terrorists. Malaysia airline flight MH17 was hit by Russian troops and it was hit by actually missile system, Buk M1, and while it was en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, killing, again, for us to know, killing 298 people aboard, most of them Dutch nationals. Immediately after the tragedy, our investigators established the fact that Russian military authorities has given command for a Buk system to be transported into Ukraine, illegally transported into Ukraine. It also established that the Russian GRU contractor, Igor Girkin, Russian national, and Ukrainian national, Igor Plotnitsky, were involved in the crime. I immediately authorized to start sharing of all of the evidence we have collected with the public and with the international community, so that the world would be aware of Russian act of international terrorism. I immediately confirmed to the public that it was a Russian military crew, that Russian on-duty military officers who came illegally from Russia crossed illegally Ukrainian-Russian border and then moved to Pervomayskaya village in Donetsk Oblast with Buk M1 missile system. Collected evidence gave ground for the conclusion that Buk M1 missile system that hit the MH17 before crossing the Ukrainian border was in possession of the 53rd Air Defense Missile Brigade of Russia, of the Armed Force of Russian Federation, deployed close to Kursk, Russia. From the very beginning of the investigation, we managed to name possible place of firing. Later, the international investigators like Valentyn, I know that you are here. Thank you very much, our appreciation. You confirmed our conclusion. From the very first day after the tragedy, I insisted that an international investigation team be created. I recommended that the Netherlands was the most fit partner to do the expert identification analysis of the airplane's debris and the identification of the bodies of the victims. My judgment was later justified as the Netherlands was quick in concluding examinations that were professional and effective. The joint investigation team was set up comprising of experts from Australia, Belgium, Malaysia, the Netherlands, and Ukraine. Like I said, right after the crash, I demanded today, Ukraine must conduct an open trial into this terrorist act, involving all countries and victims' families. This approach would make it possible to prove in Ukrainian court, with international support, the guilt of the actual perpetrators of the crime, servicemen of Russian Federation armed forces. Ukraine must now prove in court the Russian government intentionally impeded the investigation into this act of terrorism. I authorized from the very beginning to share the evidence with what actually SBU collected with the joint investigation team. It's important for us to commence a public trial. The international community and Ukraine, including Ukraine, must try the criminals, perpetrators responsible for this crime. It is vital for us, for Ukraine, to name the perpetrators in Ukrainian court, to bring those responsible to justice. In conclusion, I believe that to prevent future acts of terrorism of Russia in our country, in Ukraine, in Europe, in Great Britain, in the United States, in Australia, in Malaysia, in each and every country, it's high time for Ukraine to join NATO, to become a member of NATO alliance, to be at the forefront fighting against Russian aggression, against terrorism of Putin, but at the same time to stand with the international community, to stand for our common democratic values, to protect our lands, to protect our citizens. Thank you for your attention. Дякую вам.
Good afternoon. So Russia's war in Georgia, 2008. Why this Russia's war in Georgia is important? Because it was the first Russian invasion military operation outside its internationally recognized borders. And it was the first major violation of international law, and the consequences that Russia faced were so unimportant that it shaped later on Putin's minds about international relations, and it empowered Putin for future and following conflicts. It was the first after the war in Afghanistan, but differently from Afghanistan, it was considered as a victory, and it was considered as a reversal of last 30 years losses of Russia on the geopolitical scene. Curiously, Putin was not president at this time, he was prime minister. The president was Dmitry Medvedev, called by some of my friends, mladший president, junior president. Putin himself was, so he was prime minister, he could be minister of agriculture, he could be a director, I don't know, the president of Judo Federation, but the power moves with Putin. So he was the one who was considered as real commander. And I can recall a few examples when the European intermediaries, when they tried to settle this ceasefire agreement, they tried to call President Medvedev at least twice, and they were connected by the staff to Prime Minister Putin. And once was even in the evening at 10 p.m. when discussions that the Russian text translation of the French six-point agreement was very different. So the French president tried to call Mr. Medvedev, who was in Sochi, and he was told that he was sleeping at 10 p.m., so just after the Spokojne noći malishi, that was the famous Soviet show, Good Night Kids. So this success, as I said, really helped Putin to go farther. And why Georgia? Why Georgia was decided, why was chosen? for Georgia was like a kind of ideal victim. Very easy. First, it was, since the Rose Revolution, outrageously pro-Western, and its official aim was to join NATO. Second, Georgia was not a member of any international defensive alliance, unlike Baltic states and Poland. So it was easy to crush Georgia and to face little reaction. And also Georgia, because of its reforms and attempts to build a viable liberal democracy in post-Soviet world, was directly defiant and considered officially by then the minister and current minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia as an anomaly on post-Soviet space. So war was prepared long before the invasion, 2008, at least from 2007. And the President Putin himself gave an interview a few years ago when he said, yeah, it was prepared in 2007. So we should listen to what President Putin says, because as Garry Kasparov said, sometimes he says truth, and he's also testing international reactions. So all these debates about who started the war was provoked by two things. First, okay, it was a smokescreen, and second, also it gave to the West the excuse to excuse its weak and almost inexistent reaction. Now we know that in Russia, I've read several publications about the Second World War, and there's some very serious people who claim that the Second World War was started by Poland. So I'm not surprised that Georgia was accused to start the war with Russia. So as I said, it was a success. It was a success on several levels. First, it was a military success, but it was not a brilliant military success because Russia lost a number of military jets and helicopters, and also quite many combat forces. It was more a political success than a military one. It was a political success for internal reasons, because it has consolidated Russian society. Putin's popularity skyrocketed. And I remember, and my friends who lived in Moscow told me that people were celebrating and congratulating each other, s победой, with victory. And as I said, it was the first big victory since the collapse of the Soviet Union and all these losses. And I don't want to mention, but few opposition leaders also considered that it was a good thing for Russia to win this war against Georgia, and the parallels were made with 1945. It was a success also in international politics because, as I said, no price was paid for this invasion. There were debates, but there were no sanctions adopted against Russia at all. And Russia was even rewarded with 6 months or 8 months later with this reset policy. So they heard some criticism, Security Council of the UN, NATO-Russia Council, but the people who represented Russia, like Mr. Rogozin or Mr. Churkin, it's their job to listen to the criticism, and they were quite well prepared for that. And Georgia, of course, Georgia got some international support, money for reconstruction, but it was impossible to, as I was a main negotiator for association agreement with the European Union, it was impossible to make European Union to put in this agreement the word occupation and invasion. Even ethnic cleansing there was no unanimity from the European side, and they refused to use this term because considered it as too political. Worse than that, there was a narrative that was produced after the war, mainly based on the fact-finding mission headed by the Swiss diplomat Mrs. Tagliavini, who says, of course, that it was an invasion and Russia invaded Georgia, but yeah, both sides are more or less guilty. And it was this narrative really played a very negative role for future conflicts, because Russia understood that the Europeans are so weak that they will never name the invasion as invasion, because they have to react. Of course, there were some minor failures in this operation from Russian side. Okay, they didn't get the international recognition of the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And they dropped it quite soon, these attempts, because the most important thing was to sign agreements after the recognition of the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia to legitimize the military presence and military buildup in these territories. Of course, they didn't succeed in replacing Saakashvili with a Kadyrov type of leader, but it was quite difficult, and it was programma maximum, as the Soviet vocabulary says. So in conclusion, I would say that this war really shaped the vision of Vladimir Putin of international politics. International politics is a jungle where the West is weak, is becoming weaker, US is weak and losing its influence, and Europe is decadent and divided. Because there were some true friends of Russia in Europe who really tried to block all the attempts from usual suspects like Baltics, Poland, to punish Russia. And lots of lessons were taken from this operation. We saw Russia Today transformed, because Russia Today's previous position was, look how brilliant is Russia. Since then, they understood that this war, they more or less lost this PR war, but Russia Today has changed and focused on Western weaknesses. And also, all the techniques that were employed during this war, the use of proxies. This is the ethnic cleansing, just one of the villages before the war and after the war. They are using the same tactics in Syria, just to change forcibly demographic situation and to make the military conquest more viable. Proxies, same used in Ukraine and Syria, and the cultural part, very important. The last day of the conflict, of the war, Valery Gergiev, famous Russian orchestra conductor, was invited to make a concert, and this picture shows Georgian civilians who are listening to the concert, who is just behind in the cage. And we saw that after the liberation of Palmyr, the same image of Russia supporting culture and fighting against obscurancy was made. So directly, this war in Georgia served as empowered Putin for further violations of international law and invasions. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anna Borshchevskaya, and I'm going to speak to you today about Vladimir Putin's Syria intervention, its origins, motives, and consequences. And I will wait for the PowerPoint. Here we go. The intervention took many by surprise in September 2015, but it's important to remember that it was years in the making. Putin had been involved in Syria for years. Ultimately, it was years of Western enabling, which Putin perceived as weakness, that emboldened Putin to intervene. For Putin, Syria was always less about the country itself than how he could use it for domestic purposes and vis-a-vis the West. Putin's primary goal is always regime survival. First, I'd like to briefly put Moscow-Damascus ties into context. Putin chartered Russia's return to the Middle East since he officially came to power. He did so in the context of zero-sum anti-Westernism. For Russia to win, the United States had to lose. Syria was critical to the Soviet Union's position in the Middle East during the Cold War. Its location, bordering the Mediterranean, Israel, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq, made it strategically vital. Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, was Moscow's closest ally in the Arab world, and Moscow had deep military, economic, political, and cultural connections to Damascus. Similarly, Syria became key to Putin, a KGB man who never transcended his origins. After the Cold War, Moscow retained a naval facility at Syria's Tartus, Russia's only outpost outside the former Soviet Union, and the sole location where it maintains a permanent presence on the strategically vital Mediterranean. Both Putin and Assad officially came to power in 2000 and have worked from the start to improve ties. Assad admired Putin's efforts to reduce Western influence. Russia's arms sales to Syria quickly intensified. In January 2005, the Kremlin wrote off most of Syria's $13.4 billion Soviet-era debt. In exchange, Assad granted Russia permission to develop further its naval facilities. Arms trade and commercial ties continued to grow. What were Putin's reasons for supporting Assad? Well, they were both connected to his anti-Western posture internationally and to his domestic aims, which in the end are one and the same, to stay in power. Putin fears domestic protest. Putin, who has a poor understanding of how the US democracy functions, believes America's talk of democracy is only pretext for regime change. From the color revolutions in the post-Soviet space, to the Arab Spring uprisings, to protests within Russia, Putin is convinced the West is behind it all. This is because if the situation were reversed, this is what he would do to his adversaries. How exactly did Putin protect Assad? Since the Syrian uprising began in March 2011, he supported him unequivocally. He armed him. He shielded him at the UN Security Council. He agreed to take Syria's crude oil in exchange for refined oil products to sustain the country's military and economy. He provided loans to stave off the Syrian dictator's bankruptcy. A lesser-known example is the June 2012 Geneva Communique, a document which outlined a UN roadmap for ending violence and establishing the transitional government body in Syria. At the Kremlin's insistence, the document is vague about which opposition groups can be included in transition government, and this allowed Moscow to engage those groups that do not demand Assad's departure and elevate their importance. The Obama administration had hoped to leverage the reset policy towards Russia into concessions on Syria, but Putin perceived the entire reset as weakness and a reward after his invasion of Georgia in 2008 at that. And weakness never deterrents dictators. Thus, Putin was under no pressure to abandon Assad. In 2013, Moscow visibly increased its presence in Syria. In August of that year, Assad used chemical weapons in Ghouta, the rebel-held suburb of Damascus, killing over 1,400 civilians, which included over 400 children. In doing so, he crossed President Obama's red line for a military intervention. But Putin understood that Obama did not want to get involved in Syria militarily and worked to make sure that this desire prevailed. He warned that month, "We have our plans." He said this in the context of a discussion of an intervention in Syria, and sent, among others, a Moskva missile cruiser into the eastern Mediterranean to increase fears, to bolster perception of his unpredictability. Simultaneously, he presented himself as a peace broker, and the West welcomed it. So the West welcomed what he called a Russia-led deal to avoid military action against Assad in exchange for a Russia-supervised removal of Assad's disclosed, and this is important, disclosed chemical weapons arsenal. Resources, keep in mind, that Moscow had helped Assad assemble in the first place. Thus, Putin ensured Assad escaped a military intervention, but doubts remained about his undisclosed stockpiles, and indeed, smaller-scale chemical attacks continued. And crucially, the West sent a signal to the entire world, not just to Russia and to Assad, but worldwide, that the West will not stand by its word. It will not stand up to dictators. That message reverberated. In July 2015, as the Syrian regime was losing ground, the commander of the Iranian elite Quds force, Qasem Soleimani, visited Moscow to discuss Syria. And it was likely this was the first step towards the Russian intervention, which would come 2 months later. Once Putin intervened, his actions, particularly his bombing campaign and the weaponry he deployed, demonstrated he wanted to force the West to choose in Syria between ISIS and Assad by targeting everybody else. Putin and Assad labeled anyone who opposed Assad as a terrorist, including children. Putin said he went into Syria to fight terrorists before they make their way into Russia. That was the official justification. But the vast majority of Russia's airstrikes did not target ISIS, and at times even strengthened it. And Russia's air power unequivocally saved Assad from an imminent fall. Remember also that it was Assad who was largely responsible for the rise of terrorism in Syria in the first place. Not only did Assad inject radicals into the protest movement against him in 2011, but much earlier, during the 2003 Iraq War, he allowed Sunni extremist fighters from around the region to cross into Iraq via Syria. And I should add, when Assad supported the anti-US insurgency, Putin looked the other way. In Syria, Putin further entrenched Russia's military by establishing the Khmeimim air base, which became primary for Russian Air Force operations. Russian ships in Tartus also played a major role in supporting Moscow's aerial campaign. Meanwhile, the weaponry Moscow deployed was clearly meant more to deter the West than to fight ISIS. For instance, the Kremlin sent anti-aircraft missiles, but ISIS never had an air force. In March 2016, Putin announced that Russia had completed its mission in Syria and was withdrawing the main part of its armed forces, but this was another deception, both towards the West and towards Russia's public. In reality, Russian presence only grew. Khmeimim became permanent in October 2016, while in January next year, Moscow extended the lease in Tartus for the next 49 years, free of charge. At the same time, Russia set up its own peace talks in Astana, in Kazakhstan, to diminish the role of UN-led Geneva peace talks. In December of last year, Putin announced another so-called withdrawal, but the very next day, he put forth a draft bill to further expand Tartus into a full-fledged base by the Russian definition of the term, and signed it into law the next month. What have been the results of Putin's Syria campaign? What began as a civil war is no longer accurate. The term no longer applies. Syria is only one layer of what's a much more complicated situation. Syria has emerged as one of the worst humanitarian tragedies since World War II, with a major ethnic cleansing campaign, which Assad led against his own country's Sunni majority. Over 12 million became displaced, and approximately 500,000 have died. This is the man Putin saved and enabled as the West wavered, failed to come up with its own policy, and ultimately gave up Syria without a fight. Putin projected great power status at the expense of the West and entrenched Moscow further in the region. Meanwhile, domestically, Putin distracted his audience with what he presented as a quick and almost cost-free Syria adventure. And just as with Ukraine, he rallied feelings of patriotism to distract the public from his own domestic incompetence. Putin did not start the refugee crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis, but by enabling Assad, he helped exacerbate it and capitalize on the massive and destabilizing refugee flows into Europe to further his goal of weakening and dividing the West. And as long as Assad remains in power, most Syrian refugees will not return. Putin cynically used Syria as a training ground for the Russian military, as a testing and advertising campaign for Russian weaponry, and even to cheaply dispose of old munitions. At the same time, from Georgia to Ukraine to Syria, his actions show that he aims to reestablish a Russian presence across the Black Sea and the Mediterranean by creating and extending buffer zones along Russia's periphery, what's called in the military anti-access area denial bubbles, A2AD. By definition, these moves are an attempt to reduce Western ability to operate. Putin also ensured, if not permanent, then very long-term Russian military presence in Syria. In addition to Khmeimim, Russia now has a warm water port for large warships on the Mediterranean. Syria also brought the Kremlin partnership with Tehran to new heights and emerged as favoring the anti-Western Shiite axis in the region, with major implications for US policy. So remember that Putin always talks about fighting terrorism, but he empowers Tehran and Damascus, forces that are responsible for terrorism in the first place. Moscow's presence in Syria is enabling Russia now to take part in rebuilding the country's infrastructure. These energy resources are not large enough to make a difference on a global scale, but they're large enough to make the country energy independent. And this will offer both strategic and economic benefits to Moscow, whose control over the energy sector will solidify their role as Assad's indispensable ally. That position will also justify the continued Russian military presence. Putin is now working to helping Assad reestablish control of territory in Syria. He assured Russia's permanent military presence in the country, and he's working on power projection in the region and boosting Russia's arms sales. Russia's air defense systems in Syria put Moscow in a position to potentially limit Israeli air forces' freedom to maneuver, while Tehran continues to expand in the Levant. Syria remains extraordinarily complex, and this conflict is far from over. It's dangerous and it's volatile, it's unpredictable. But to date, in the absence of strong US leadership and moral clarity, Putin has much to celebrate. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Carpenter. I'm the Senior Director of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. I'm a former State Department, White House, NSC, and Pentagon official, and I've dealt with Russia in all of those roles. What I want to do right now is try and tie together all of the streams that have been presented to you in terms of Putin's wars. Putin's war in Georgia, Putin's war in Ukraine, Putin's war in Syria. I'm going to start out with a very simple proposition. Russia today is at war with the West. It's not always a kinetic war, it's often covert, but Russia is engaged in an assault on Western democracy. And all three of these conflicts are part and parcel of that conflict. What are Putin's goals? Putin wants to weaken Western democracies internally. He wants to develop fissures within the transatlantic community, within NATO, and within the EU. And he wants to delegitimize the rules-based international order. In doing this, we've seen Putin adopt an all-out, no-holds-barred, confrontational response to Western democracy, Western promotion of democracy. There's been a lot of talk about this concept of the Gerasimov doctrine, hybrid warfare. Well, it's not really Gerasimov's. It's not really a doctrine. It's Putin's, and it is a playbook designed to undermine the institutions of our democracies. And in doing this, in launching this covert attack on the West, what the Kremlin has done is it has suspended all norms and rules of not just interstate behavior, but generally speaking, all norms, all rules. It lies, it cheats. Nothing it signs can be taken for granted as the word of a nation state. And this applies to the conflicts in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Syria. We have had a 6-point ceasefire negotiated between then President Medvedev and then President Sarkozy in place since 2008. None of it was ever fulfilled. We've had 2 Minsk agreements in Ukraine in September of 2014 and February of 2015, neither of which has been fulfilled in the least. There are more than 10,000 dead in Ukraine. And in Syria, I personally was involved in negotiations with Russian generals from the general staff on cessation of hostilities arrangements, especially in the lead up to the tragic annihilation of Aleppo, that were never honored from the very minute that my interlocutors were negotiating with me. We've seen Russia try to foment a coup d'etat in Montenegro and assassinate the sitting prime minister of the country. So my point is, there is no normative basis to any of Russia's actions. Lately, we've seen assassinations. We've seen previously for decades in the Soviet period on a regular basis, and then in the post-Soviet period as well, extrajudicial killings within Russia. And by the way, the domestic repression at home and the aggression abroad are intimately related. But now we've also seen over the last several years, especially an uptick in the rise of what's called mokroye delo, wet work or assassinations. So murders of, for example, ex-lawmaker Denis Voronenkov in Kyiv, or now, unfortunately, the tragic poisoning in the UK of Sergei Skripal and his daughter, and potentially also of British police officers. We've seen this time and again. Mikhail Lesin here in the United States, in Washington, D.C. Political agreements, arms control. We see Russia violating the INF Treaty, developing a cruise missile prohibited by that treaty, lying about it, claiming that there's no violation, pointing the finger at the United States as if we were somehow violating the treaty when in fact they are, to confuse our allies. Violating the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, violating all the basic fundaments of what they have signed up to, what the Kremlin signed up to in the post-Cold War order. Not just the Helsinki Final Act, not just the UN Charter, but the Charter of Paris, the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And somehow the West looks at this and either it doesn't sink in or it sinks in and we don't acknowledge it. We don't respond. We continue to blindly adhere to the tenets of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was signed in 1997, as if somehow that document had any relevance today, when Russia is assassinating or trying to assassinate people on Western soil, where they are engaged with regular troops in Ukraine, where they are occupying land in Georgia, and by the way, in Moldova as well. Other nation states, other powers are watching right now what Russia is doing and wondering if they can get away with this too. China, North Korea, Iran, all the disruptive powers within the global system are looking at Russia, seeing what Russia's doing, its aggression, its violation, as I said, of all the bedrock norms that we all established as the international community after World War II, and we're doing nothing about it. Let's be honest. Look at the sanctions that were just adopted the other day by the Trump administration. Sanctions that had already been adopted against Russia in December of 2016, against the very same individuals and the very same entities. You have news organizations, reputable ones, talking about how this is a tough new Trump administration policy on Russia. Well, I'll be the first to tell you, the Obama administration's response to the interference in our election was ineffectual. It was weak. And the response today is even weaker. Do we expect, honestly, that if we don't impose costs on Russia for what it is doing to Western democracies, trying to undermine them, subvert them from within, using asymmetric tactics, using what some have called the chaos theory, and what was alluded to earlier today, trying to export chaos into democratic systems where we have free media, free markets, pluralistic political competition, because Russia knows that it doesn't have those things, and so therefore it is less vulnerable. So in the chaos theory of undermining other nation states, you impose chaos because you yourself are an authoritarian dictatorship, and so you don't have the same vulnerabilities. You're not susceptible to the same sorts of actions and modus operandi. So what do we do about this? Well, I think the West needs to take a good hard look at what Russia, this covert war that Russia is waging against the Western world, and basically do 5 things. First, we need to strengthen our alliances and our partnership in a way that we are only beginning to do, but not seriously enough. As I said, the NATO-Russia Founding Act does not apply. We need to put more troops, more forces on the eastern flank of the alliance, not just to deter the Kremlin from potentially invading the Baltic states, which I don't think is particularly likely, but to impose a cost so that Putin sees, oh, wait a second, I did that in Ukraine, and now all of a sudden there's a brigade of NATO troops in the Baltic states. Maybe that's not what I wanted. But we also need to build the strength of our partners and build our resilience, which is point number 2. We need to reduce our own vulnerabilities. Russia is Russia. When I say Russia, by the way, I mean the Kremlin. I don't mean the Russian people. I don't mean the Russian nation. I mean the Kremlin. The Kremlin is exploiting our vulnerabilities. Money laundering, investments in real estate that are non-transparent, our campaign finance system in this country, at least, which is completely open to foreign flows of money. And I am convinced, for one, that there is Russian money floating around in the last electoral cycle and probably in the next one and the one after that. We need to reduce these vulnerabilities. We need to wake up. We need to clean up our own system and prevent ourselves from being a vector for or a target of Russia's attack on democracy and democratic institutions. Third, we need to be much more aggressive in countering the corrupt networks, because it is often the primary tool that the Kremlin uses is corruption, the weaponization of corruption. They unveil themselves into Western political and business circles, using oligarchs, using other corrupt actors. We need to have better interagency coordination. We need to have a sense, first of all, that they're doing this, a sense of priority about countering it, and go and root out some of those networks. And I hope the Mueller investigation begins that process. But there is so much more that needs to be done, an interagency task force and other things. Fourth, and this is crucial, we really have to impose serious costs on Russia. The sanctions that the United States has applied on Russia are frankly a drop in the bucket. They're inconsequential, largely speaking, as compared with the sanctions that the United States and the international community have applied to other rogue actors like Iran or North Korea, where we've gotten serious and we've applied what are called full blocking sanctions on their financial institutions. So far, we've applied full blocking sanctions to exactly one Russian bank, Bank Rossiya, a crony bank that at the time was the 26th largest bank in Russia. None of the top 10 banks, Sberbank, Gazprombank, you name it, VTB, none have been sanctioned with full blocking sanctions. Instead, we've applied debt and equity financing restrictions. Well, what is that? That is nothing. Why can we not take action and impose costs? Because let me tell you, and I know this audience knows this, but if Putin does not look back on his aggressive adventures outside of Russia, or if the Kremlin does not look back 5 or 10 years from now and judge that the costs outweighed the benefits, they'll continue marching forward, because believe me, a lot of these subversive tactics, using energy as a coercive tool, using disinformation, cyber, corruption, as I said, they're cheap, they're easy, there's no consequence. And as we've seen in this country and many others, they're effective. Lastly, we need to do a better job of standing with Russian civil society, with the Russian opposition, with those people in Russia that believe in a democratic future for their own country. And a lot of politicians in the United States talk about this, but where are the resources? Where is the effort? It's largely invisible. We need to support that Russia, because that, hopefully, is the Russia of the future. Thank you.
We will now take a short break. The theater program will resume at 2:30.